Shall we play a game?
We got one person online. The workload is enough for like 10 users. I think we got a hacker.
Shall we play a game?
What are they doing to him? Breaking into his mind. It's like hacking a computer. All it takes is time.
Red alert! All hands to battle stations.
Hello, friend.
Welcome to Red Spy 365.
Shall we play a game?
So, hello and welcome to another podcast. I've not done one for about a week or so. I was out in Vegas, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Vegas. But it's been hectic. Managed to get through 13.31 of Red Spy now. So, for those of you that have Red Spy, you're looking forward to an exciting update. In fact, you'll see the reason why we added this significant event into it, and you'll see the reason why the significant event is becoming important, because in 13.3.1 we've now completed the metrics and the reporting. There's a lot more into it. So that's kind of like really important. So Black Hat was really interesting this year. I was out there, I was doing a data sciences class, and that was really interesting. You know, that was kind of different. What I wanted to understand and really what I wanted to take away from it was where I could take the machine learning and where we can apply it into Red Spy. And initially, I was always thinking that, you know, I could put it into the decision support system, which is coming up in 14. But I really kind of understood that maybe sort of the nested if-then statements in the decision support system is enough, because really what I'm looking for is the classification, or using the machine learning for classification. And it was really interesting because it kind of focused me on, you know, not trying to put machine learning into something that just because it's machine learning, you know, it just doesn't need it. Sometimes there's categories of where it needs it. Sometimes there's categories of where it don't need it. But one of the things that, you know, I discovered at Black Hat was that, you know, some super cool tools that are going on out there. And I'm just going to mention three of them: Apache Drill, Apache Zeppelin. And if you deal with Python on a daily basis, or if you're a Python coder, or if you want to get into Python coding, look at Jupyter Notebook. It's because that's really where, you know, Python seems to be, you know, we're talking about R and everything else beforehand in data sciences, but Python seems to be the language now that it's kind of going to be for data sciences. And we're also seeing, like we said, that separation of the people that write the algorithms, and sort of the real math heads, you know, the ones that put symbols on the board that I don't understand, to really the implementation of it. And really with Python and being able to import pandas, and, you know, basically in data sciences, being able to run these imported libraries, these have the algorithms already in there, so you don't necessarily need to understand the algorithms as much. It's more a case of how to implement it and marry it up to what you want to do. So one of the things I've looked at, obviously, is, we've talked about significant events, and a significant event in Red Spy, you know, maybe, you know, someone grabs a password, or someone gives me a password via a phish campaign. That is a significant event. It becomes more of a significant event, obviously, if I can reuse that password and gain access to the internal side of things, you know. But that's inside the system. That's what my system sees. You know, we see the threat surface, we see the vulnerabilities. In fact, I've been talking to some companies that deal with some interesting things about vulnerability databases and how they can marry that up with, you know, CVEs to, you know, products. It's kind of going to become interesting, put it that way. But really what I was looking for in the machine learning side of things was, if I could take the machine learning and take an intelligent threat feed, you know, and I've got a couple in mind that I'm not going to mention right now, but, you know, just give you an example. Take about a Twitter feed from someone. And if I can run a comparison against the data set that I already have, in other words, when I talk about a data set, or a company data set, that's everything that we see on the company, you know, sort of the IP addresses, ports, services, those kind of things. And if I could take a threat feed and marry it up with the data set that we see, I can add in some machine learning to say, hey, maybe this is a significant event based upon the data set that we already know. In other words, have the system learn, on a threat feed, that it's going to be looking for something. It's going to be looking for a significant event in a threat feed, and it's only going to suggest it as a significant event in comparing it to the data set of the organization. You know, the quick example would be, You've got say you've got an Oracle service, and it notices that maybe in the threat feed there's a lot of things being talked about Oracle, and it might suggest to the analyst to say, hey, this potentially is a significant event based upon the information that we're seeing in the threat feed, and based on what the data set of the organization is. So obviously it's looking at, it knows there's Oracle services running on the data set, and maybe, in the threat feed, it might be seeing there's a new Oracle vulnerability out. That's kind of like a simple explanation. But obviously, there might be ones where they talk about, financial sector attack, and you technically might be a financial sector company, in which case that potentially is a significant event. And when I say potentially, I feed that into the decision support system. So I think that's where, if I was to look at something where machine learning can really play something in RedSpy, in other words, it could be like the watchtower, looking not just at your organization, but at the company or the world in general. As analysts, we monitor threat feeds, we monitor, intel feeds, what's going on. But really, we want to be able to put some machine learning into it so that we can suggest, or so that the machine can suggest that this is a potential significant event, even if we've missed it, or even if we've not seen it. Because potentially, if you think about it, you could put hundreds of threat feeds in and have it monitor hundreds of threat feeds, as opposed to an analyst maybe being able to monitor one or two. So that's something definitely I'm exploring right now. And of course, I've mentioned that in 14, we've talked about some of the what we call a decision support system, but also the repository. I'll talk about the repository in a second, but I want to talk a little bit more about Black Hat. One of the things that I came away with, I went through the vendor hall. I spent sort of half a day just going around the vendors, talking to some companies that, obviously as part of RedSpy, but also just looking at the sort of general direction. If I was going to take a Wordle picture, the biggest word that would stand out here would be automation. We're seeing a lot of that event, this automation. There was a really good graph, and I've incorporated it into my PowerPoints. And it was, to me, it kind of smacks exactly what RedSpy is. And so it's value. The graph was value over time. Okay, so, and it showed the two basic elements: insight and cost. And obviously, when we talk about insight, especially when we talk about vulnerabilities, the idea is if we notice a vulnerability early on, that is much more valuable to us than, say, 6 months down the road. And potentially, the cost early on is going to be a lot cheaper, potentially, than the cost later on of the organization finding something. So for us, insight, trying to gather that information and try and notify those information as soon as we can, that's where the value is for us. We've got to be able to find that information much quicker. And this is why we've introduced some of the metrics with things like mean time to notify, mean time to respond. In other words, you responding to say, you accept, or you've understood, or you've acknowledged the fact that we've notified you about a risk. And then, mean time to remediate. And we want to, that's kind of one metric we call the dwell time. So we have that, time to notify, time to respond, and for your time to remediate. The idea is that we can capture that metric. And we've also created the ROCE, and I'll talk about the ROCE on another podcast because I think it's going to be more visual. So I might do it as a YouTube video for sure. But it's definitely more interesting. But so the biggest thing I take away was automation. I started looking around, a lot of automation. And really it becomes clear as, the biggest problem, I think, in security is the emulation side of things, the threat emulation. And I always talk about back in the day, back in the day, if you found something, you would go to the community, you would present it to the community would say, fantastic, that's a great vulnerability or a great exploit. You get your kudos from that. But as we've seen the monetization of this, and I'm not necessarily talking about bug bounty programs or those kind of areas, but we've definitely seen, law enforcement go after the security researcher type thing. So less people, if they do find something, are less likely to post it and talk about it, and because they don't want to get sued if they've created something. In fact, we just saw that with just the Bluekeep. Bluekeep came out, and for some reason, the security researchers were like, hold on a second, we don't want to give the world this. just because the bad guys are going to use it, which is great in one sense, but it's also not exactly fair because you're going to test in depth and show impact to an organization. So while we've seen a lot of the security research go underground or not being as public, we've also seen a decline, I think, in the direct code execution. It's becoming more complex. As things become more complex, we're seeing more mistakes. And I think that's where you've seen a lot of these mistakes occur on some of the bigger organizations. So you're seeing. We said we saw this information or the ability to provide the vulnerabilities and the exploits kind of be reduced. So how do we combat that? How do we combat that in a security field? How there's other ways you can do it with crowdsourcing. I think crowdsourcing is one way of doing it. But if we said that the rewards of getting the kudos is not as good anymore, people want monetary payment for it, that's where we have to address it, I think. And so we know that creating the most cutting edge attacks requires a great deal of research, lots of research. And the best way to sort of do that kind of research very quickly is to crowdsource it. And if we said that, it's not good enough now just to give people a pat on the back for working those hours, we want to reward them and reward them well, then you end up having to create what I've already talked about before, which is the marketplace. We've got a framework, like we said, Red Spy. Red Spy is the framework, that you can build a scenario in, not just an exploit. It has to be a scenario. This is why I think a lot of companies, when they're just concentrating on the exploit, there was no monetary value in that as such, or it wasn't a business model because it's just purely an exploit. If, however, we're creating the marketplace and we're taking scenarios, so if you're a security researcher, if you're a Red Spy user and you create content, in other words, maybe you've created a new remote admin tool, super cool. And you've got this great scenario that if you send out a fish, someone clicks on it using your remote admin tool, it's got some great bypass AV stuff in it, fantastic. You've created this content. Why shouldn't you be able to sell it to the good guys, not the bad guys? Because this is really what we're trying to do, is move you away from the bad guys. But if you've got this and you've built it and you want to sell it to the good guys, then you should be able to sell that scenario in our marketplace, and other Red Spy users should be able to purchase that, or maybe if they've got a subscription, get credits for it. That really, I think, is a crowdsource model that works, but also it addresses two things. I think it addresses that people don't do things for free anymore. I think it addresses the fact that, even as an organization, trying to keep up and create, every kind of cutting edge technique out there, we can rely upon tools to do it, but that's still not going to be the cutting edge stuff, the stuff that hasn't been created before. So we want to get that to that point where we're creating the stuff that hasn't been seen before. That's only going to be able to be done with crowdsourcing. And we've got to reward those people for creating that content. And then you've got to make it secure so that, one, people can't steal that content. And also that if they can't steal the content, that the content can only be used in your framework. So that if it does get out, it's basically useless because it just only gets used in your framework. And you could actually provide that content to sort of the AV, the FireEyes, the good guys of the security field, so they then can start working on things to sort of detect and mitigate that new thing that you found. Because essentially that's what we've got to do. We've got to make things better. And so I think what we're working on addresses that. Now, I'm going to look at being able to do that through containers. If you've never played with Docker, it's an interesting kind of tool. I mean, I think we went from physical machines to virtual machines to virtual applications. And so, application isolation, this is where Docker comes into play. And so you can create or put your application or maybe your rack inside a container and, build that scenario. And one of the things I'm looking at is being able to add an action in Red Spy so that it will literally run a Docker. So we run scripts. We have the ability as an action to run a script, but maybe we'll have the ability to run an action as run a Docker container. But we're going to assign profiles. There's a lot to it, put it that way. But we've kind of got it. I've got the framework now all written down, and it just it's the next phase is how we're moving forward. That being said, we've still got 13.4, which is, I've got a lot of feedback stuff in there that you guys have given me. There's also another part we're working on, the UI. So the user interface, we know it's, I won't say it is outdated. It's the best what we could do at the time. I mean, we understand it works, it's functional, it's, pipes and bells. I always think of it like a warship where everything's exposed. Your pipes are exposed, they're not encased, it's not designed to look pretty, it's designed to be, for us to be able to function with it. We want to be able to put almost like a skin on it, and so that we have this business layer skin, so that it's, for people that aren't as complex or don't want to get into the side of the technicality of it, that we can put this skin on it and it could kind of, paper over some of those pipes so it looks, I wouldn't say prettier, I think it changes the functionality of it for you, so that you don't necessarily need to see certain parts. You don't necessarily need to be doing the bot creation. Now, one of the things we've also done is adding that monthly report, which is kind of cool. It really is actually. I always say I have the best development team in the world, and it was definitely borne out this time. Not only did they do it within 26 days or 27 days, but they kept on spec and they went beyond spec, which I thought was really cool. Because, it's, if you imagine, it's hard. I'm a pretty good taskmaster at times. I'm probably a pain to work with, but at the end of the day, we got to have it exactly how we got to have it. But what I was excited to see was, my guys get it. They totally get it. They totally get the project. So we've got some interesting things coming up. Black Hat showed me that automation was definitely where things are going. Even if it's to filtering and being able to filter out the chaff, and we're doing that with our significant events and how we're using the metrics. So, you're going to see bots and the criteria and how we filter. So even on events now, you can filter on events. So we've got that part sort of filled out. So we've seen Black Hat automation. We're doing our metrics. We've kind of got the roadmap now for 14 with, containerization, Docker, Kubernetes, etc., where we know how we're going to be able to integrate into the system. And that was kind of key for us, I think, being able to get that part, being able to work out how the marketplace will feed. We've also, we've got this community version, so hopefully we're going to be able to release a community version. We might be able to do an education version, because at the end of the day, one of the things I want to be able to do is get this in the hands of the content builders, the guys that are going to build content for this system, and be able to reward those guys, And I've always said that this is going to be like the app store for hackers building scenarios. It's not necessarily going to be a pure exploit. It might be, you might have, the thing is, you might have found a fantastic way to be able to, bypass a word macro filter or something. And what we're going to be able to do is get you to be able to sell it to multiple Red Spy users. Bug bounty programs are out there as well. We might be able to feed it into a bug bounty program, be able to give you the proceeds back of that as well. I mean, there's multiple ways we can do this, but essentially what I want is to be able to get content builders, guys that are creating the most cutting edge stuff, and being able to feed them into Red Spy as well as, obviously moving things forward with the decision support system, with being able to take threat feeds in and being able to, create a significant event based upon sort of global things that are happening around the world and seeing if it's significant enough for your organization. So there's always kind of stuff that we're working on, which is really cool. The other stuff, I can't remember since the last time I'd done a video. I was talking to someone, one of the guys, I forgot his name. Let me just bring up his name, because it was really quite a good post that he did to me. Where was it? And he said it was part of the Equifax breach, which I thought was kind of interesting, because it was definitely a social engineering attack. That it was really, really super clever. I felt this was a really good. Just seeing if I can find it. There you go. So the chap's name is Jason Statlander. You can actually go to jasonstatlander.com. That's Jason, Jason, Statlander, which is STADTLANDER.com. And he had a really good write-up on a fraud attempt against him, a social engineering phone call. I'll give you the synopsis of it, but I would suggest you read his blog. He's got some interesting stuff up there. But they gave him a lot of information. I mean, just lots of information. Almost, that I would think would feel for most people. If they knew your credit card and the last four numbers, knew your address, gave you social security, everything about you. He was smart enough to realize that they asked for his PIN, and obviously at that point, he realized something was up. But it's an interesting blog, quite interesting. But we're seeing how social engineering is definitely becoming super more sophisticated, and this is where, as they become more sophisticated in the attacks, we've got to become more sophisticated in the defenses. That being said, this sophistication means complexity. Complexity is sort of the nemesis of security. And really what happens is that, unless things are tested, mistakes will happen. And this is where I think it's interesting, and I think I've mentioned this before, that the UK talks about, in penetration testing the assurance of the security defenses in place. That's important to understand, that you want to make sure, usually traditionally you say, hey, switch everything off. And that's not necessarily good, is it? Because you want to test, hey, if I did this, does this happen? Even when I talk about, scanning people or testing people, they say, well, shall I just whitelist your IP? And I'm like, well, not just yet. No, let me test to make sure that maybe your auto shunning, blocking, your detection capability picks me up. And then we can go to the next layer on the onion. Like I said, everything to me is an onion. It's just going through different layers. And so, bearing in mind that, you're trying to look for those routes in, sometimes goes beyond. And even then, to a point, I think testing is evolving where, and this is where I think threat emulation comes into play, and I think this is going to play super well into the marketplace and how we present that to people. Because one of the things we talk about is going beyond the next layer. So, okay, you've got this great candy defense. It's a hard shell candy, and it's a great defense. There's nothing open. You hardly ever expose anything. But let me go beyond one layer. So, let me give you the executable like you can in Red Spy. You can download the malware and execute it to see, one, if your detection capabilities will find it. And secondly, does it execute? Does it work? Because let's face it, your IPS is going to, or your IPS and SIMs, they're going to be reporting what they see. They're not going to be reporting what they don't see. An IPS doesn't turn around and say, oh, by the way, I saw 2 things today, but I missed 3 others. It's just going to say, I saw 2 things. And you hope that there wasn't 3 others. Might be 10 others, might be 1 other, might be no others. But at the end of the day, we want to be able to test the assurance of the systems in place so that we can have that detection. You won't believe how many times I've done a test, and visibility is great. They see me doing the attacks. They see, because sometimes you've got these automated systems that are doing certain automated things that are quite noisy, and then you've got manual parts where we're doing manual parts, and that might be a bit quieter. But they might see even the manual parts, what's going on. Then as soon as I go encrypted, we disappear off the radar. Because they don't decrypt at the edge, or they don't have encrypted traffic analysis, or there's no protocol inspection, or there's lots of different ways. Like I said, it's becoming complex. And I think as we, even when we look at, what we're doing, I think with the evolution of like the physical to virtual machine to the containerization, we're seeing some really interesting stuff go on there. I mean, it's by no mere mistake that, you saw VMware purchase Carbon Black, which I thought was a brilliant acquisition from VMware. Because I like Carbon Black, I think they're pretty good endpoint protection, and when you see that, that's pretty effective. But don't forget that VMware bought Kubernetes. Kubernetes is the orchestration and deployment of containers like Docker. So virtual machines and virtual applications, you're starting to see VMware get into both of those sides. And then if you had virtual applications with packet inspection or file inspection level Carbon Black type stuff, that could be really interesting for the future as well. It really does become interesting. If you've not looked into containerization or Docker, suggest you look at it. Like I said, on the data science side of things, definitely look at things like Apache Drill. Apache Drill is really cool because one of the things it does is it can take like CSV spreadsheet. In fact, let me take a step back. Data sciences, 90% of data sciences is normalizing the data. In other words, gathering the data and making it so that machine learning can work with it. You know, this data normalization is like 90%. Now, there's a lot better things coming out that are able to automate that process. That's where it's become, that's really, once we get to that part, we can normalize or get to the normalization of data, you know, the pre-processing it, getting it ready for machine learning. If we could get that part automated, then, you know, you're going to see kind of like the Dreamweaver of data processing or machine learning. But essentially, we're almost there. But Apache Drill can take multiple databases all over. So you can have it in, you know, ODBC, you can have it in SQL, you can have it in Oracle, you can have it in CSV, and bring them all together under one roof. And it does it amazingly fast. It is like super fast. So that's kind of where we sort of seem to be heading on that. And then you have sort of Apache Zeppelin, which kind of does a similar kind of thing. But it's like, I'm trying to find, let me see, give you the description. It says, you know, Apache Zeppelin is a new and incubated multi-purpose web-based notebook which brings data ingestion, data exploration, visualization, and sharing collaboration features to Hadoop and Spark. So it actually goes beyond that as well. But if you're not into development, which most of us aren't, you need to be aware of some of these names. You know, these things that are coming up. So like, you know, Apache Drill, Apache Zeppelin. You know, in fact, let me give you the definition of Apache Drill. You know, Apache Drill enables analysts, business users, data science developers to explore and analyze data without sacrificing the flexibility and agility offered by these data stores. The Drill processes the data in situ without requiring users to define schemas or transform data. That's important to understand. And it's open source, it's free. This is what we're seeing. I mean, one of the things about this, and you'll see a huge battleground, things like Apache Drill, Apache Zeppelin, you know, Jupyter Notebook, it's all free. This is open source and free. So it's, you know, you got to understand this is where things are going. But it's an interesting, when you start getting into the data sciences side of things, you know, like I said, you know, people, when you talk about machine learning, people laugh and they say, oh yeah, what, nested if-then statements. And that's true to a certain extent, but nested if-then statements have their place. But really machine learning is for sort of, you know, data classification and prediction, you know, based upon sort of learned data sets. And that's where it really becomes useful. Or maybe even taking data and applying algorithms against it. So it's, you know, what we call unsupervised data, just to see if there's any patterns, any, you know, pattern anomalies, outliers, anything out there. So it really becomes interesting when you start. That's really good for incident response. And this is why I said it's good for classification of is something a significant event or not significant event for me. So I can take a threat feed, is something a significant event? Is it not a significant event? You know, that's classification and predictive classification. That's where it should be. When I started looking at it, moving it into the data decision support system, it didn't kind of fit. It might be that we can put it in towards the end and we can have, you know, classify the tools and predict whether those tools would be successful. That's kind of one area that I'm looking at. But again, I'm not trying to take a square peg and trying to fit it through the round hole regardless, just because it's machine learning, because it's, you know, things have its place, and that's really what's interesting to me. I always tell people I have actual learning as well. We have artificial intelligence. I have analysts. They are intelligent. The other thing I've been getting quite into is the Udemy courses. If you've ever seen them, you can pay like $10 for a course, and they'll do like machine learning, they do Jupyter Notebook. I was doing one on Python. I've done a couple on Python now. You know, just those kind of things. And I think, you know, from a tool set perspective, things like Udemy or Coursera for education are really useful. You know, I think it may be something that we do as a division as well, and start sort of looking at how we can do these classes and courses and sort of do it en masse, because it, you know, it's almost like you're just learning a specific segment. And so I was doing one on Dockers and containers. You know, one of the questions is, you know, obviously we talk about trying to be able to take an app or an application, put it inside a container, or create an image of it. You know, create a Docker image, run it as containers. So we want to be able to take that app, put it in an image. Now, I want to be able to encrypt that image which is good. That's doable at rest. I think Rocket was going to be able to do that a lot better. Take it, encrypt it at rest, but also encrypt it at runtime. So I've not seen anything out there at runtime. So if anyone has anything, encryption at runtime, I think there was a commercial tool that may be able to do that, but it looked pretty expensive to me. It may be that we have to put an agent inside our image and be able to run it and encrypt it and decrypt it on the fly at that. There may be some way around it like that, in which case, hey, we'll create our own encrypted Docker containers. Because it's important, because if you're as a content creator, I just want to be able to use the application. I don't want to be able to decompile it or have other people decompile it and then sort of reuse your scenario. I want to make it so that it's unique content to you. So that's important to understand. It may be that, it's unique content. We use it in Docker container. We don't encrypt it at first, and then we sort of just monitor who's, trying to sell something similar to yours in a marketplace. And that may work, that may not work. I think it might be better if we encrypt, but doesn't seem to be anything out there unless someone knows about it. So what else has been going on since the last time? Something? It's like 2 weeks in security is just a nightmare, isn't it? I mean, it's just like everything and anything happens. I like this one, which was, despite billions in spending, your military-grade network may still be leaking data. Security Shop Egress studied 4,856 personal data breaches reports collected from the UK Information Commissioner's Office and found that in 60% of the instances, someone within the affected biz was at fault. Human error. Human error was found 43%. It's actually on the register. This is a pretty good website, theregister.co.uk. They're kind of a bit of tongue-in-cheek at times on the IT security side of things. But, what was interesting was, 20% of the exposure were caused by faxing a file to the wrong person, and 18% were caused by typing the wrong email address into an email field, or failing to use the BCC and exposing every recipient. By comparison, just 5% of the leaks were due to someone falling victim to a phishing attack. It's just that when that happens, it tends to be much bigger and much more damaging than a misdirected email. And that's true. It's kind of like the phishing side of things, isn't it? When I say, like, I'm sending out phishing emails and, people use other products that are designed for security awareness training to reduce the click rate, that's great. But we can do that, but my emphasis is really on gaining access to the desktop or gaining a credential and then reusing that to see what other impact we can do. That's why it becomes much more of a bigger impact than someone just, sort of giving me a username and password. It might be that you're using two-factor authentication, which, mitigates that kind of attack, or you're not using it, in which way we can show, hey, look, this is a bigger impact. This is why you should be doing two-factor. So, my side of phishing, when I look at phishing, I want to be able to, gain access. That's, a lot of times security awareness training type phishing is designed to reduce the click rate. That's fine. I think by now, especially if you read what Jason's blog, I thought it was kind of interesting because it's really going to be kind of hard to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate phishing emails. Technically, we can do some things. Other times it's pretty hard to be able to identify what is bad and what is good. That being said, we've seen that a number of I've seen a thing about Bluekeep 2. It's now ported over to some of the Windows 10. We also had that hacker that basically has been charged with some fresh charges because she was working on the AWS, and apparently she accessed 30 other hosted orgs as well. Again, the insider threat is always a big deal, and this is we saw that with obviously the NSA, and we've seen that obviously with AWS now on the commercial side of things. So that insider threat exists, and it's a big deal. Do you understand, and are you monitoring these people and what they're accessing, and is anomalies being detected? And I think that's where especially these outliers and what we call normal traffic and outliers or anomalies, this is where machine learning I think is going to really come into to help. And of course, we've got the standard ransomware that's been going on. we haven't seen a lot of. Saying that, I was about to say we haven't seen a lot of crypto mining, but then the person that was charged with breaking into the AWS services, she was also charged with like putting a load of crypto mining stuff on it. So maybe there was a little bit out. Maybe it's just the people doing both. People doing the ransomware, crypto mining, whatever. In fact, what is the Bitcoin currency right now? Let's have a look. The Bitcoin currency price. 9,544 for one Bitcoin. About 10 days ago it was at 10,900, so it's dropped 1,000. Maybe that's why we're seeing this switch to ransomware, but I got a feeling we'll start to see that go up again. I think you'll, and when you see Bitcoin start to go up, then you'll see the crypto mining stuff start to go up, which is annoying, but it's definitely not as devastating as ransomware. That being said, we've seen a number of nation-state attacks still. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to cover. I think that's it. I mean, bearing in mind, takeaways from this, take a look at a couple of tools, sort of homework. Not homework. Homework sounds terrible. These are things to look up. If you're not playing with Udemy or Coursera, have a look at those for learning. It's like $10 sometimes you can do a course. Also look at some tools, things like Apache Drill. There's actually a Griffin virtual machine out there. If you type in Griffin virtual machine, see if it brings that up. Griffin virtual machine. Griffin Data Science Virtual Machine. That's got a lot of things installed. You might want to have a look at that. That was part of our course out there. Look at Apache Drill, Apache Zeppelin. You definitely want to get into Python. I mean, regardless, you're going to have to. If you're doing data sciences, Python seems to be the way to go. So if you're doing languages, Python. It seems to be the key watchword here. We're cracking on. We've got 13.3.1. I'm just waiting for 13.3.1 to be finalized. Literally one thing I'm waiting for, and I can push 13.3.1 out to you. That really does finish off the metrics. I've got to do a really cool video on that because I want to show you how that metric works. It's definitely going to mean you're going to be working with us, especially if you're an existing RedSpy client. We may have to revisit you and start sort of working out, how we can sort of gather some data, because we need some of your institutional knowledge that you have in your head and put it into RedSpy so that, the metrics work better for you. The more effort you put into RedSpy, the more it's going to pay off dividends for you. The other part is obviously we're cracking on with 13.3.2, and obviously we've got 13.4 coming up, and then the biggie 14.0, which is, as we are working on. If anyone wants to be a part of 14.0, feel free, because we've got a lot of work we've got to do, and I think it's exciting. Definitely the way ahead for us. But again, I appreciate your time. As I said, I always appreciate for you to listen to me. Why anybody listens to me, my father says, is beyond him. But again, thanks, and we'll see you soon.
Shall we play a game?
We got one person online. The workload is enough for like 10 users. I think we got a hacker.
Shall we play a game?
What are they doing to him? Breaking into his mind. It's like hacking a computer. All it takes is time.
Red alert! All hands to battle stations.
Hello, friend.
Welcome to RedSpy 365.
Shall we play a game?